Good afternoon, Mike. How are you today?
Good. How you doing, Pam?
Good, good. So I feel so honored to have you for this interview series with TRN. Today's topic is around expanding the role of the CISO. And you and I have had this conversation in the past, so you're spot on for the right person to do this interview. And I thought how we would kick it off is just have you do an introduction.
Sure. And thanks for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity. So, I'm Mike Towers. I'm the CISO at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. There's quite a few people that may not know who Takeda is, but we're roughly the 8th largest pharmaceutical company in the world. Japanese headquartered, but a huge international presence, just like most big pharmas nowadays. Been here for a little over 3 years. Been in the life sciences sector for 25 years and been doing security leadership in various roles since about 2008. So it's been a long, fun, but impactful ride.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, so I think, starting, I like to start at the 10,000 foot level and just ask the big question, how do you see the CISO role expanding?
Yeah, so a lot of the answers and some of the discussions we'll have today, I'll just caveat at the beginning and say, sometimes it's very industry specific, sometimes it's maturity specific of the company, and sometimes it may come down to the individual. But broadly speaking, I've seen it move in a number of possible directions. I mean, at the end of the day, many of us in security, the first question is, what are you trying to protect? So a CISO role could expand if what you've been asked to protect expands. And that could be something like the physical security space or the supply chain space. I think another area would be shifting more toward risk management. And I know much of us are trying to be risk management professionals, but risk thinking is slightly different from security thinking in most corporations. So that's another path. I think another path I've seen is getting more intertwined with actually what your company's business outcomes are. So that would be like a product security role. If you're an e-commerce company or something like that, you're obviously the product of that e-commerce is important versus just protecting the internal network, if you will, which most CISOs have been doing for a while. And I think the other area could be just, because some of us and many CISOs, the job has historically been somewhat technical. Maybe there's just more technology leadership. Maybe you become the CTO, or you get ownership of infrastructure, or you get ownership of data. So there's a number of different directions I can see it expanding. And I think it's an interesting question because a lot of the CISOs I know, and I know they've been doing this for a while. They've been doing it well. And a new challenge is something that many folks are looking to develop into.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think because the role is so crucial and cyber risks are continuing to escalate, these opportunities are coming up because they're, we have very senior business leaders in these roles. And so it seems like a natural progression. But what do you think the challenges are? Because there's clearly challenges with expansion. I mean, it's not like the job is extremely busy already. So how do you expand, and what are those risks with this expanded role?
Yeah, good question. I think first and foremost is scope management and expectations management is going to be key. I mean, I think scope management and expectations management are two very, very difficult challenges for CISOs overall. And I think if the role expands, it becomes even more so. I think most people in most industries that have been doing security leadership for a while, we've gone through that evolution of that path where we're trying to educate and partner with the business so that folks understand that this isn't just an IT problem, or it isn't just a technology problem, that security is actually a business problem. And that's taken a lot of energy and a lot of good discussions and engagement with the stakeholders. But if you expend your role, then immediately you're distracting attention from all that energy that you built up. So, and I think, frankly, there's reputationally some challenges to work through, that if a dedicated leader is a CISO and now all of a sudden he or she has more responsibility, then you may have diluted the attention for that area. So I think there's an important element of that. I think the other risk that I've seen both outside and with folks that I'm close to, both within and outside my industry, is that, and I'll talk a little bit about this, I can talk a little bit about this later as well, but and get into more details on it. But when a CISO extends its role, his or her role, it's very, very likely that the other areas you're extending into aren't going to be marketed as well by the news and all the breaches and the Wall Street Journal articles and all that. So there's been a level of comfort, I would say, in the ability to get funding and sponsorship from the CISO perspective. If you extend other parts of a role, that's not going to be the same. So there's going to be a little bit of an element that's going to be extending our capabilities from a sponsorship perspective as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So have you, without any attribution, of course, have you seen some challenges from some of your peers in this area, and anything specific, like whether it's expanding into physical security, which may seem more natural, or fraud versus, say, infrastructure or chief data officer roles?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and I've experienced some of this myself even, but yeah, I think so. Let's take a couple of examples. I think if you expand into infrastructure, for example, I think infrastructure in a large, massive international corporation, you're going to become a firefighter. And I think, all of the challenges that some of us have been dealing with from the CISO perspective, now you own the quote unquote help desk, the wide area network, whether or not an executive's Wi-Fi access point works, all of that is going to be very, very distracting. And it's going to potentially take your attention away from, probably what the most people are wired to do, which is the business protection elements of security. I think another example would be in the product or the physical security space. Again, if you're a large company, physical security is not cheap. So it becomes a huge budget target. So when you're thinking about the gun gates and guards, if you will, for all your buildings, and some of the other travel security and all that, those are big cost elements that and are frankly are very, very challenging to manage as well. So it's interesting what I've seen and experienced, both myself and with some folks in the industry that I'm pretty close with.
Excellent. Yeah. And then, it's not just about expansion. I think also the role has been elevated. And this is kind of a twofold question, but, as cyber issues escalate, and will continue to escalate, what's that leadership role? How does that role get elevated, not only on the leadership team, but at the boardroom? And then, there are conversations about having the CISO role report to the CEO. I don't have any in my group, but there are conversations that are happening. And so, not just about expansion, but any comments on elevating the role?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, well, I'll be blunt and say, first and foremost, I think for most CISO scope areas, and a lot of CISOs may invest some time and energy telling you how different they are, but a lot of us have very, very similar responsibilities: access management, intelligence and analytics, incident response, et cetera. I think a more traditional CISO type of responsibility, even if you do it very, very well, the likelihood of that reporting directly to the CEO is in my opinion, pretty low. And I think one of the things that CISOs have often, there's been this talk about whether or not a CISO should report to the CIO. I think CIOs, frankly, and IT organizations in general, they are the best at delivering cross-functional and cross-business unit capability in most big companies. They're better than finance, they're better than HR, the legal, all the other cross-cutting functions that any of our companies have. IT is likely the best. And having a CISO who has similar challenges, making impact across the business, latching on with IT is probably a good idea, because you could leverage that success. So it's funny that we're talking about extension, because I think the role would need to extend to report to the CEO, getting into areas like risk or resiliency or trust, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. I think that from a elevation perspective, though, we also have to recognize that data, digital, and technology are becoming fundamental underpinnings of any business. I think anybody who even 5 years ago had these discussions about, well, is there technology involved or not? Well, for most industries, you'd be hard pressed to find anything the business wants to do that doesn't have a technology element. So any risks or threats to information security or technology is going to be a threat to the business.
Mhm.
So this bifurcation that business leaders take, well, is there technology or not? I mean, that's going away because it's always going to be a yes. And I think that the other area that I would say that it elevates the visibility potentially is that many CISOs, if you think about the pure definition of information security as the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, most CISOs have been focusing on the C, where in reality, a lot of the latest threats are much more focused on the I and the A pieces,
Mhm.
which in many industries are much, that there's a much tighter link to business leadership of what that could do to the business. So I think all of that elevates the perspective of the role.
Yeah, I definitely, it's interesting you brought up the CIO because I'd say like, 50, maybe 60% of my group, is reporting into the CIO, and there's some friction there, but your comments make sense for sure.
Yeah.
There is a lot of debate, and maybe the CIO is a bit of a stretch, but what is that logical reporting order? And it's always a big debate.
Right.
Yeah, so I've heard you and I have had these conversations about looking a little bit more like the tech industry and having this role be more of a chief trust officer. And I know that like Salesforce, I think, was the first one to adopt that title, and others have followed suit. How do you see the chief trust officer role being different or even the same as the CISO role?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, and it's no accident or surprise, frankly, the tech companies were the first to adopt this. Workday has one, SAP now has one. As you mentioned, Salesforce has one. And I think part of the reason why they've had it is because when your business is soup to nuts digital and soup to nuts technologically, nothing will impact trust or erode trust quicker than some sort of security incident. So I think that what I call the currency of trust, if you will, is the combination of things like security, privacy, compliance, but there's also a strong ethics element as well, because as things like analytics get better, we're all dealing with some of the ethical challenges of analytics, whether it's ML or AI or surveillance or whatever. So any of those compromises, the more digital you become, which, as I said before, we all are, the more directly and more acutely that the trust of your company by your external stakeholders is going to be impacted if you have any incidents. So I think, and there's a woman named Karen Alazi, who's one of the top ethical hackers in the world. She's from Tel Aviv, and I remember seeing her speak once. And a lot of it boils down, is similar to some of the themes she talks about, that she believes that security is evolving from a business of protection to a business of trust for that very reason, because so much of our lives are digital now and based on data, that there's inherently a trust relationship for anything that impacts it.
Yeah, I like that. Protection versus trust. I mean, especially when we think about, well, whoever our ultimate customer is, the consumer has become much more educated about cyber, and we have to think about creating that trust. And so it's a really good point. And then the other topic that we've also talked about in the past, and I know your role is growing in this way, is you speak about resiliency and how that's foundational to your responsibilities. And that focus on always having uptime, for example. And I guess that's super important in the pharma industry. How can other CISOs be thinking about resiliency and their role? And I guess too, if you create that focus, you have to have a pretty strong leadership team to lead on, so that you can rise to that level of resiliency. So any comments on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's something I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about and having some discussions even internally with my own team and with peers in the industry as well. But I actually think that let's take biopharmaceuticals, for example, the industry that I've been working with in for a while. There's basically a very, I would say, common value chain, even though different pharmas work in different therapeutic areas, maybe they focus in different geographies, but generally speaking, the value chain is the same. We research and develop new treatments, we make them and distribute them, we engage with physicians to have confidence to prescribe them, and then we engage with the patients for ongoing healthcare. I mean, that's generally speaking what we all do. And I think anybody in other industries, you could likely break down your business into that value chain. Well, at the end of the day, your job as a leader is to make sure that all parts of that value chain are resilient. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is, and no disrespect or any or criticism of any of these things, but you look at the NIST framework, you look at, traditional IT-based security, how's your network security, how's your endpoint security, how's your cloud security. Unless you're in a business where technology is purely your business, none of those are congruent with your business value chain. So going in front of the board and having metrics on how we're doing with cloud security, how we're doing with endpoint security are frankly irrelevant. So what we've been challenging ourselves, I think, is of course, all those things are important. And we have plenty of those discussions internally with specific stakeholders. But how are we managing the risks to our R&D process? How are we managing the risks to our manufacturing process? How are we managing the risks to our ability to engage with physicians and healthcare practitioners? So from a resiliency perspective, we've been doing a lot of focus on that. And I think I'll say this specifically to our industry in biopharmaceuticals and in healthcare in general. This is a huge pivot point because other than education, the healthcare industry is probably the most, I would say, backwards in terms of a lack of historical innovation. And it's also a very, very in-person centric type of industry. So, and let's face it, COVID forced our hand a little bit, but we've had to learn to become much more digital in this industry. And at the same time, it's also an industry, we're all patients. There's a lot of sensitivity. There's a lot of sociological impact. It gets politicized sometimes about how it gets paid for. So it's a very, very emotive industry as well. So you're dealing with this data. There's a critical resiliency element as well, and just purely how you protect the data. So I think a lot of that has forced, or at least pivoted us to think much more about linkage to the resiliency of the value chain.
Yeah. I mean, great comments. And I think too, and this sort of leads into the next question is, and a common conversation is how does the CISO role align more tightly with the business? We're really here to serve the business. And I think, being focused on resiliency is showing that you're aligned with the business. But, so not only with resiliency, but other ways that CISOs can, be more aligned with the business, because I think that's a crucial part of the role and the evolution of the role and the elevation of the role. Yeah,
it's a great question, Pam. And this part of it, frankly, is probably the most challenging, at least in my experience, both recently and over the past few years. So I mentioned all of the focus on resiliency, which I truly believe is important. But the biggest challenge that presents is that, generally speaking, most of the really good security people aren't business resiliency people. So you're going to find really, really good security analytics people, data lake people, or Splunk, or whatever technology you want from a high-end data analytics perspective. You're going to have really good network security people. You're going to have really good, potentially, data security people. You're going to have all of these hardcore experts in a security field. But do they know, again, using my industry as an example, do they know the R&D business process? Do they know how pharmaceuticals are manufactured? Do they know the challenges of getting, APIs from various parts of the world and turning them into medicines? All of those things so it's an important pivot point in terms of development. Because if you are going to resonate with your business leadership, you have to be able to speak in those terms. So it's something that I've been dealing and talking with my leadership team about is, and again, there's no right answer here, but are the leaders in your team, are they the types that want to get plucked out of their role and maybe become a security leader in a completely different industry?
Mhm.
If they're going to be a pure security technology expert, if you will, then they're frankly limiting their ability to get that prominence with the business because it's not congruent.
Mhm.
So I think there's definitely a pros and cons there, and I think it's an important, transparent discussion we have to have with our people to develop them properly.
Mhm.
Because, and I've actually had, really effective handshakes and people exiting the organization because they would rather be hardcore security people than biopharmaceutical resiliency people. So if that's the way that they're wired, so be it. But in terms of being truly a business executive in this area, I think it's an important distinction that we have to make.
Yeah, yeah, and I think all the points that we've touched on today kind of lead back to the underpinnings of having a really senior executive team underneath you. Having really strong leadership, as you do, and I can't say that about it. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to build that really strong leadership team, and I think it is as I said, the underpinnings and also requirements to being able to expand the role or elevate the role, or even focus, like you said, on trust or resiliency. I guess as a final kind of closing question, any ideas or brilliant input on how you've successfully built this really strong leadership team? Because you really have. I know your people and they're phenomenal.
Well, thanks for that. And I'll make sure that they hear that
Yeah.
they are great. But I think that this is an interesting one because I think broadly speaking, I would say, the collective CISO community has been clamoring for more executive presence, not because they want the exposure, but generally speaking, because they want recognition that this is a real business problem, which I absolutely agree with. But if you're going to put that C, let's remember the C of CISO. If you're going to be a chief officer in a business, we've got to start acting like it. And, you can't go in front of a board and talk about DevSecOps. You just can't. It's just, things that are much more. And I think that there's a couple of areas where almost the success and the prominence and the momentum of our role have got us in a little bit of trouble. The first one is I call the honeymoon of fear. So we're used to getting a lot of money, a lot of sponsorship, because no one wants to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. No one wants to have that breach. So the skill and energy for most CISOs to get budget is actually not very strong because they haven't had to work very hard to get budget. So and in other parts of the business, I mean, how good can a security person be to ask for a $20 million investment, where if that $20 million can't be used for a new gene therapy line in R&D? That's the type of thinking that we have to have. And I think that there's, again, if you take my industry, for example, we're engaging with patients directly and digitally in a way that we wouldn't even be dreaming of doing 5 years ago. So security is an enabler and a requirement to do that. Mm-hmm. It's not somebody builds a finished product and hands you to protect and add the seatbelts and airbags to. You're involved with building that entire structure, and that's an important part of the business. So I think that there's some real business value thinking that's important here. How important to the business is the assurance that your team is providing? That's just a thought-provoking question. For many CISOs, success is invisibility, which is fine. It's like a good referee in a soccer game or an offensive line in football. If you've done your job, it's nobody mentions your name. I mean, in many respects, security is like that. But is that the way that your business is evolving? And related, I think that there's a linkage there of an arrogance risk. Because again, security leaders, many of us have been in front of the board far more than our own bosses have. I know I could say that across 4 companies. I've been to the board far more than my boss because security is top of mind. It's all over the news. And frankly, the auditors want to make sure that it's appropriately protected. So at some point, that energy is going to wane, and we're going to have that discussion of what real true business value means for the investments that we're making. And my advice, or at least my thoughts, would be that we have to make sure that we're prepared for that, because it is, and depending on the industry, that may come sooner rather than later. But to me, it's really around shifting the energy away from traditional, I would call it technology stack security, to business value, and what an investment in security and in your function actually means for the business.
Yeah, excellent. Super. Well, we're out of time. Any final comments before we close?
No, other than just thank you for the time, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to more discussions like this. It's an important role in my mind, especially in my industry, to get resiliency across the board. So I look forward to more conversations like this, both within your network and elsewhere. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I so appreciate your time. Really great. And look forward to furthering the discussion, as you said. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.